Today, I'm going to do something a little different for this installment of Your Next Dive. Normally, I've tried to take you to a dive destination where we talk about the trip from a number of different perspectives: the travel, the lodging, the dive operator, and the diving. Now, we've been around the world. But today, I'm going to focus on one particular dive that is almost in our backyard. It is one of the most iconic dives here in New England, and that is the wreck of the Chester Poling off of Gloucester, Mass. The Chester Poling was a coastal tanker that sank in a brutal storm on January 10, 1977. The tanker had just left Everett, Massachusetts, and was bound for Newington, New Hampshire. That information is pretty consistent in the research, but there is other conflicting information about where she had been and what cargo she delivered. For example, some documentation said that she had previously delivered kerosene to New Jersey, while others indicated that the heating oil was delivered to Everett, Mass. I would suspect that delivery to Everett, Mass to be more likely. Always interesting when you are doing research to get this type of inconsistency. Now, the Chester Poling was built in 1934 at Mariners Harbor, New York by United Dry Docks Incorporated. It was originally christened the Plattsburgh Saucony. Somewhere along the line, it also was known as the Mobile Albany, before getting renamed as the Chester Poling. At the time of its sinking, it was owned by the Motor Vessel Poling Brothers, and that was number 1 Incorporated. I wasn't able to find who it was actually named after, but obviously some member of the family. So that's a little bit of history about the ship. Now, on January 10, 1977, Captain Charles Burgess was in command. The forecast for that day was for 35-mile-an-hour winds along with 15 to 20-foot seas. The Chester A. Poling left Everett at 6:30 a.m. Well, as we all know, forecasts can be wrong. The winds built up to 50 miles per hour, and the seas got as high as 30 feet. Facing the mounting seas, Captain Burgess tried to get more stability by adding more ballast. But at 10:30 a.m., a 30-foot wave smashed into the tanker and broke it in half. The captain called for abandoning the ship. 6 of the 7 members of the crew were saved. I believe it was the cook, J.O. DeRosa from Providence, Rhode Island, who perished. The stern section of the Chester Poling came to rest off of Eastern Point, Gloucester, originally in about 75 feet of water, with the bow section sinking about 4 miles off of Eastern Point in about 190 feet of water. Subsequent winter storms moved the stern section to its present location about 800 yards off of Eastern Point in about 95 feet of water. I think the bottom might be a little bit deeper than that, however. The stern section of the Chester Poling is what some folks call a Hollywood wreck, sitting upright, and is probably the most popular wreck dive off of Cape Ann, as that area is known. Now, I first dove the Chester Poling way back in July 2005. It was my 40th dive, and the double dip on the Poling was part of my advanced open water class. These dives would constitute my deep and wreck advanced open water dives. At that time, I was still diving in a 7mm wetsuit with the appropriate gloves and hood. I used a standard aluminum 80 tank with Nitrox 32. I can still remember the anxiety that I had doing the first real wreck dive in the Northeast. But once in the water, what an amazing dive. The visibility that day was 30 feet, and my max depth was at 85. Even though it was July, the water temperature on the wreck was 50 degrees. It was incredible to move along the deck and reach the midship section where the tanker broke in half. Absolutely mesmerizing. But with an aluminum 80, you don't get much bottom time. And after about 15 minutes, we headed back to the upline, and after our appropriate safety stop, we climbed back aboard the boat and got ready to do it again. Total dive time was 26 minutes. The second dive that day was just as spectacular and pretty much the same profile. Let me just say, in a wetsuit, it can get pretty chilly. I didn't go back to the Chester Poling until August 2009, and that was my last trip there. It was my 249th dive, but this time I did it in a dry suit and hoped to get some good video of the wreck. I still dove with an aluminum 80. The dive was just as I remembered and just as exciting. Visibility again was 30 feet and my max depth was 82. And the bottom temperature that day was 48 degrees. Still very cold, but so much better in a dry suit. Again, however, with an aluminum 80, you just don't get much bottom time, especially if you're task loading, like shooting video. So my recommendation is that if you are planning to dive the Poling, you might want to consider a little bit bigger tank, something like a Steel 100 or going to doubles. I know that I wouldn't consider going back with anything less than a Steel 100 tank. So how do you get to the Chester Poling? Back then we used Cape Ann divers, but they closed up several years ago. And recently, the dive boat Cape Ann Diver 2 was purchased by several guys from Boston, and they are now operating regular charters again. The Cape Ann Diver 2 is a 45-foot U.S. Coast Guard registered dive vessel. It is spacious, and right now, with limited divers on board, you get plenty of room to get ready and dive. But you don't get a lot of time because you don't get a lot of time to get ready because the wreck is only a few minutes from the dock. So be prepared. One thing different about Northeast wreck diving is that as a diver, you need to bring all your gear. That includes tanks, weights, everything. It's not like diving at a resort. Don't get caught short by not being prepared with all your own stuff. Now, here's an interesting element that I discovered during my research. It appears that in the 1960s, the Chester Poling was lengthened by maybe 26 or so feet. That doesn't sound like much, but at the time of her sinking, her length was 282 feet. So that lengthening was about 10% of the original ship's length. Could this have been a contributing factor for the ship splitting in half? I wonder. So, if you happen to be in the area of Cape Ann and Gloucester, Massachusetts, you might want to look up Cape Ann Diver 2 and head out for a double dip on the Chester A Poling.